January 17th, 1942, Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. The snow falls in silence over the dark pines surrounding the Führerhauptquartier, each flake dissolving against the frozen earth like the illusions of men who believe themselves invincible. Inside the concrete bunker, beneath layers of camouflage netting and reinforced steel, Adolf Hitler sits before a mahogany desk cluttered with intelligence reports. The air smells of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of ink still wet on decoded telegrams. His fingers, pale and trembling slightly, grip a single sheet of paper, a summary from the Reich Ministry of Armaments. The numbers printed there seem impossible, almost obscene in their magnitude. American production figures, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, factories that never sleep, assembly lines that never stop, a nation transformed into a machine that breathes steel and exhales warplanes. He reads the figures again, his jaw tightening. 50,000 aircraft projected for 1942, 45,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. The page crumples slightly in his grip. Outside, the wind howls through the forest, and somewhere in the distance, a generator hums with the same relentless rhythm now pulsing through the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles. Hitler sets the paper down, stares at the wall where maps of Europe display the red arrows of Wehrmacht advances, and speaks words that his adjutants will later recall with uncomfortable precision. The Americans cannot possibly achieve these numbers. It is a bluff, a propaganda trick to intimidate us. Their society is too soft, too divided, too corrupted by Jewish capitalism and Negro music to sustain such discipline. But even as he speaks, there is something in his voice, a hairline fracture in the certainty, a note that wavers like a compass needle sensing magnetic north slipping away. This moment, buried in the winter of 1942, represents more than one man's miscalculation. It is the collision of two ideologies, two visions of human organization, two prophecies about what free men can accomplish when their civilization faces extinction. Hitler had built his philosophy on the belief that democracy was weakness, that individual liberty produced chaos, that only totalitarian discipline could forge a nation into an instrument of will. America, in his estimation, was a mongrel country, racially impure, morally decadent, incapable of the sacrifice and unity required for total war. He had said as much in Mein Kampf, had repeated it in 1,000 speeches, had structured his entire strategic vision around the assumption that the United States would fracture under pressure, that its industrialists would prioritize profit over patriotism, that its workers would strike rather than serve, that its melting pot of ethnicities would boil over into ethnic conflict rather than coalesce into a unified force. The German General Staff shared this assessment. They had studied American performance in World War I and concluded that U.S. intervention had been tactically clumsy, logistically sluggish, dependent entirely on French and British infrastructure. The American economy, while large, seemed oriented toward consumer goods, refrigerators, automobiles, radios, luxuries that indicated a soft populace unaccustomed to hardship. German intelligence reports from the 1930s described labor disputes, racial tensions, isolationist movements, and economic inequality. The picture they painted was of a nation wealthy but fragile, powerful in potential but crippled by its own libertarian principles. When Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he did so with a sense of dismissive confidence. America would send troops eventually, yes, but they would arrive slowly, fight half-heartedly, and sue for negotiated peace once the casualty lists grew long. The real war would be decided in the East, against the Soviet Union, before American industrial power could fully mobilize. But intelligence reports are snapshots, and snapshots can lie by omission. What Hitler and his generals failed to grasp was that American industry in peacetime was not American industry mobilized for survival. What they interpreted as decadence was actually slack capacity, an economy operating at partial throttle, capable of explosive acceleration once the throttle opened fully. The factories producing Chevrolets and Frigidaires were not monuments to weakness. They were proof of an industrial infrastructure so robust, so technologically advanced, so deeply rooted in a culture of innovation and mass production, that converting it to war material was not a painful transformation, but a natural evolution, like a river changing course to follow gravity's imperative. The shift began even before Pearl Harbor. In May 1940, as France collapsed and Britain stood alone, President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year, a number so staggering that his own military advisors thought it a rhetorical flourish, impossible to achieve. But Roosevelt understood something fundamental. American industry ran on competition, on the entrepreneurial hunger of men like Henry Ford and Henry Kaiser, on the engineering creativity of a workforce educated in pragmatic problem-solving rather than rigid doctrine. When the government offered contracts, industrialists responded not with bureaucratic caution, but with the aggressive optimism that had built the railroads, electrified the cities, and turned assembly lines into a secular religion of efficiency. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan became the cathedral of this new faith. Groundbreaking began in April 1941. By May 1942, the facility was producing B-24 Liberator bombers, 4-engine heavy bombers, each weighing 30,000 pounds empty, each containing hundreds of thousands of individual parts. The assembly line stretched over a mile long. At peak production, Willow Run completed one B-24 every 63 minutes. Workers, many of them women who had never touched a rivet gun before the war, operated in 3 rotating shifts, so the line never stopped. The plant ran through midnight, through dawn, through the blistering heat of summer and the frozen darkness of winter. Lunchrooms served meals at all hours. Child care centers opened their doors around the clock. The hum of machinery became a constant symphony, interrupted only by the roar of engines as finished bombers taxied onto runways bound for Europe, for North Africa, for the Pacific Theater. This was the reality behind the numbers that crumpled in Hitler's hand. Willow Run was not an anomaly. It was multiplied across the continent. In California, the Kaiser shipyards broke every record for maritime construction, using prefabrication techniques adapted from the construction industry to weld together Liberty ships, cargo vessels of 10,000 tons displacement, in an average of 42 days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was completed in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch, a feat so extraordinary that it seemed to violate the laws of physics and economics simultaneously. In Pennsylvania, steel mills that had operated at partial capacity during the Depression now glowed red around the clock, their blast furnaces fed by trainloads of iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range and coal from Appalachian mines. In Texas, oil refineries expanded to produce the 100-octane aviation fuel that would give American fighters a performance edge over Axis aircraft. In Connecticut, factories that once made typewriters and sewing machines retooled to manufacture M1 Garand rifles, Browning machine guns, and the Norden bomb sight. The statistics became almost surreal in their immensity. By 1943, the United States was producing more war materiel than all Axis powers combined. The annual output included 86,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 24,000 armored cars, 96,000 aircraft, 17 million rifles and carbines, and 64,000 landing craft. The federal government spent approximately $90 billion on war production in 1944 alone, a sum larger than the entire U.S. gross national product had been in 1933. Unemployment, which had plagued the nation throughout the Depression, vanished. Labor force participation reached levels never seen before or since, as women, minorities, and older workers flooded into factories. The cultural mythology of Rosie the Riveter was not mere propaganda. It reflected a genuine social transformation as 6 million women entered the industrial workforce, performing tasks previously reserved for men and performing them with equal or superior competence. But Hitler, insulated in his wolf's lair, filtered all information through the lens of his ideology. When updated intelligence reports arrived in late 1942, confirming that American production was not only meeting but exceeding Roosevelt's projections, he dismissed them as exaggerations. When his own Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, presented analyses showing that German industrial output was being eclipsed by American capacity despite frantic efforts to increase production. Hitler blamed sabotage, defeatism, and Jewish conspiracies. He could not accept the fundamental truth that a free society, once mobilized, could outproduce a totalitarian state precisely because freedom fostered innovation, because capitalism harnessed competitive energy, because democracy, messy, argumentative, chaotic democracy, created resilient systems capable of adapting to crisis without waiting for orders from above. The German war economy, by contrast, operated on principles of centralized control and hierarchical rigidity. Production decisions required approval from multiple overlapping bureaucracies. Factory managers feared making changes without explicit authorization. Innovation was suspect because it disrupted established procedures. Moreover, Nazi ideology actively hindered efficiency. The regime's racial theories excluded millions of potential workers, Jews, Slavs, and other designated subhumans, from skilled positions, wasting human capital on an industrial scale. Forced laborers, driven by fear rather than incentive, worked slowly and sabotaged equipment when possible. The entire system optimized for ideological purity rather than practical output, a fatal flaw in a war where material superiority determined outcomes as decisively as tactical brilliance. German soldiers on the front lines began to sense the disparity before their leaders acknowledged it. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps faced British forces equipped with American-made Sherman tanks, which arrived in such numbers that even when destroyed, they were immediately replaced. Rommel wrote in his diary of the material superiority of his opponents, noting that for every German tank knocked out, the Allies could field 3 new ones. In the skies over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots watched in exhausted disbelief as American bomber formations grew larger month by month, first dozens of B-17s, then hundreds, then 1,000-plane raids that darkened the sky like migrating locusts. Each bomber represented thousands of man-hours, tons of aluminum, rubber, steel, and electronics, yet the Americans seemed to possess an infinite reserve. Shoot down 10 bombers and 15 appeared the next day. The psychological effect was crushing. German pilots, many of them skilled veterans, began to understand that skill alone could not overcome arithmetic. The diary of a Luftwaffe lieutenant recovered after the war captures this dawning realization. We shoot them down by the dozen, and still they come. Our factories work day and night, yet we see fewer of our own planes each month. Theirs multiply like locusts. How can a nation of jazz musicians and Hollywood actors build such machines? Are we fighting an enemy or a force of nature? This confusion, the inability to reconcile propaganda with reality, eroded morale more effectively than any Allied bomb. German soldiers had been told they were the master race, biologically and culturally superior, destined to rule. Yet here they stood, outnumbered and outgunned by the products of a society they had been taught to despise as weak and degenerate. The symbolic weight of American production manifested in unexpected ways. For German troops, one object came to represent the chasm between economies: the Jeep. The Willys MB, a quarter-ton four-wheel drive vehicle produced in staggering quantities, over 600,000 during the war, became ubiquitous wherever American forces operated. German soldiers captured in Normandy, in Italy, in the Ardennes, reported being astonished not just by the number of Jeeps, but by their apparent disposability. Americans used them for everything: transporting officers, hauling supplies, mounting machine guns, towing artillery, evacuating wounded. When a Jeep broke down, it was often abandoned and replaced rather than repaired, a luxury inconceivable to Wehrmacht logistics officers who meticulously salvaged every usable part from disabled vehicles. German troops scavenged abandoned Jeeps eagerly, not just for transportation, but as totems of American abundance. The Jeep, simple and rugged, became a four-wheeled argument against everything the Reich stood for. It represented not Aryan perfectionism or grandiose engineering, but democratic pragmatism. Good enough, mass-produced, endlessly replicable. Hitler's response to these accumulating realities evolved from dismissal to denial to desperate rationalization. In conferences with his generals throughout 1943 and 1944, he clung to the belief that American willpower would crack before American production could decisively tip the balance. He fixated on imagined fractures in the Allied coalition. Surely, he reasoned, the capitalist Americans and communist Soviets would turn on each other before defeating Germany. He placed faith in wonder weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, convinced that German technological genius would trump American industrial brute force. He retreated into astrological consultations and Wagnerian fantasies of heroic last stands, unable to process the cold calculus of production tables and tonnage charts. Albert Speer, who became Minister of Armaments in 1942 and oversaw Germany's final desperate efforts to increase output, later wrote of Hitler's cognitive dissonance. He could never accept that our ideological assumptions were wrong. To admit that American democracy could outproduce German discipline was to invalidate the entire foundation of National Socialism. So he invented excuses, Jewish manipulation of statistics, British exaggeration, secret sabotage by defeatist generals. Anything rather than face the truth that a free, multi-ethnic, capitalist society was simply better at organizing human effort toward a common goal. Speer's memoir, written in Spandau prison, carries the weight of a man who participated in evil but possessed enough intellectual honesty to acknowledge defeat's causes. The transformation in perception among ordinary Germans occurred more gradually, filtered through layers of propaganda and censorship. But by 1944, as Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble and American troops poured across France with seemingly endless supplies of fuel, ammunition, and equipment, the reality became undeniable. German civilians, queuing for rationed bread and enduring freezing winters without adequate coal, heard whispered stories from soldiers on leave about American supply depots where food was piled so high it rotted before it could be distributed, where gasoline flowed so freely that vehicles idled for hours without concern, where every soldier seemed to carry chocolate bars and cigarettes in quantities that suggested wealth beyond imagination. These stories, perhaps embellished, nonetheless reflected a fundamental truth. American logistics operated on principles of abundance rather than scarcity. The U.S. military calculated that keeping one soldier supplied in a forward combat zone required shipping approximately 7 tons of material monthly: food, ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, medical supplies, mail, and even recreational items like magazines and phonograph records. The logistical pipeline stretched from American farms and factories across oceans to ports in Britain, North Africa, and later France, then via truck convoys to frontline units. The scale of this enterprise dwarfed anything the Axis powers attempted. The Red Ball Express, an Allied trucking operation following the breakout from Normandy, moved 12,000 tons of supplies daily over improvised routes, driven by soldiers, many of them African Americans in segregated units, who worked in relays to keep the front supplied as it raced across France. For Hitler, ensconced in his various headquarters as the Reich crumbled around him, the cognitive dissonance intensified into delusional irrationality. In April 1945, with Soviet forces battling through Berlin's suburbs and American troops crossing the Elbe, he still spoke of turning the tide with phantom armies, with divisions that existed only on paper, with wonder weapons still on drawing boards. His final recorded comments on American industry, delivered in rambling monologues to aides in the Führer bunker, blamed Jewish financiers for manipulating the American economy into temporary hyperproductivity that would inevitably collapse into chaos. He predicted that within months of his death, the United States and Soviet Union would destroy each other, vindicating his theories posthumously. He died by his own hand on April 30th, 1945, having never truly understood how thoroughly his assumptions had failed, how completely he had misread the nature of the enemy he dismissed as racially inferior and industrially impotent. The historical evidence of American production speaks through dry statistics that acquire poetry in their implications. In 1939, the United States produced 5,156 military aircraft. In 1944, that number reached 96,318, a 16-fold increase in 5 years. Shipbuilding rose from 237,000 tons launched in 1939 to over 10 million tons in 1943. Tank production grew from 331 in 1939 to 29,497 in 1943. These numbers represent more than economic output. They embody a mobilization of human will, a collective decision by millions of individuals to subordinate personal comfort to national survival, achieved not through totalitarian compulsion, but through voluntary participation in a cause understood as existential. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt termed it, proved not a metaphor, but a literal description. Democracy itself, with all its messy inefficiencies, transformed into a weapon that fascism could not defeat because fascism could not comprehend it. The symbolic Jeep, humble and ubiquitous, rolled through the ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945, driven by American GIs who distributed chocolate to German children and chewing gum to refugees. These small acts of casual generosity, products of an economy so productive that even foot soldiers could afford to be generous, completed the ideological defeat more thoroughly than any military victory. German civilians, starving and traumatized, encountered American soldiers who were not the racial degenerates of propaganda, but ordinary men, often friendly, usually well-fed, universally well-supplied. The contrast between Nazi rhetoric and American reality destroyed the last vestiges of Hitler's ideological legacy more effectively than any tribunal or re-education program. The transformation extended beyond material production to cultural confidence. American popular culture, the jazz music Hitler derided, the Hollywood films he condemned, the democratic ideals he mocked, flowed into occupied Germany alongside the tanks and trucks. Germans who had been taught that their culture represented humanity's pinnacle discovered that American culture, for all its commercialism and supposed vulgarity, possessed a vitality and optimism that traumatized Europe desperately needed. The Marshall Plan, which would rebuild Western Europe with billions in American aid, represented the logical extension of wartime production philosophy. Problems could be solved through abundance, through the application of wealth generated by free markets and distributed through democratic institutions. This approach stood in stark opposition to the Soviet model of imposed scarcity and authoritarian control, a contrast that would define the Cold War's ideological battleground. In the archives of the Reich Chancellery, captured by Soviet forces and later studied by historians, documents reveal Hitler's final assessments of American industrial power. Marginal notes in his handwriting, scrawled beside intelligence reports, show a progression from skepticism to frustration to incoherent rage. One notation, dated February 1945, reads, "Impossible figures, enemy propaganda. No nation can sustain this." Beside it, an aide had penciled in smaller script. "Our own intelligence confirms. Their production increases monthly." Hitler's response, slashed in angry strokes, "Traitor estimates, Jewish manipulation of data." Reality had become, for him, indistinguishable from conspiracy, because accepting reality meant accepting the failure of every principle he had championed. The American industrial miracle of World War II rested on foundations deeper than factories and assembly lines. It emerged from a culture that valued education, rewarded innovation, and permitted failure as a learning process rather than a punishable offense. It drew strength from immigration, the very racial mixing Hitler despised, which brought diverse perspectives and skills into a collaborative environment. It leveraged capitalism's competitive energies while tempering them with government coordination, achieving a synthesis of free enterprise and collective purpose that neither pure socialism nor pure laissez-faire could match. The system was imperfect, marred by racial discrimination, labor exploitation, and corporate profiteering, yet it functioned with sufficient effectiveness to produce in 4 years more military equipment than all other combatants combined across 6 years of global war. The epilogue to this story unfolded across decades. The factories that built bombers converted to producing automobiles, appliances, and eventually computers. The organizational techniques developed for wartime logistics revolutionized corporate management. The engineers and workers who won the production war became the architects of post-war prosperity, their skills channeled into building the suburbs, the interstate highways, the consumer economy that would define the American century. The GI Bill educated millions, transforming a generation of factory workers and farmers into professionals and entrepreneurs. The industrial infrastructure, expanded exponentially during the war, provided the foundation for economic growth that would make the United States the world's dominant economy for the remainder of the 20th century. Hitler's miscalculation thus ripples forward, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological blindness. He failed to understand that democracy's apparent weakness, its tolerance of dissent, its diversity, its decentralization, constituted its ultimate strength. Free people, once convinced of necessity, mobilize with creativity and determination that no amount of authoritarian discipline can replicate. They innovate without waiting for permission. They adapt without fearing punishment for deviation from doctrine. They work not from fear of the lash, but from belief in the cause, and that belief sustains effort across years of sacrifice. The Jeep, that simple four-wheeled symbol, encapsulates this truth. It was not built by slaves or coerced labor. It emerged from competitive bidding between American manufacturers, refined through practical testing, produced by workers earning union wages, distributed through a logistics network organized with democratic flexibility. It served every theater of war, every allied nation, a mechanical ambassador of the system that created it. When German soldiers encountered captured Jeeps, they encountered evidence that their leaders had lied, that the mongrel democracy across the ocean was not weak but formidable, not decadent but disciplined in ways that transcended mere obedience. In the forests of East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair stands in ruins now, its concrete bunkers crumbling, its secrets excavated by historians. The mahogany desk where Hitler read those production figures rotted away decades ago. But the Jeeps remain, preserved in museums, still occasionally driven in parades, tangible connections to a moment when free nations proved that liberty and strength are not opposites, but complements, that abundance springs from freedom, that democracy, for all its flaws, possessed resources that totalitarianism could neither match nor comprehend. The snow still falls over those dark pines, dissolving into earth that once trembled with the machinery of tyranny. And in that dissolution lies a larger truth. Empires built on lies about human nature collapse not merely from military defeat, but from the weight of their own delusions. Hitler heard the reports of American factories running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and called them impossible. They were not impossible. They were inevitable, the natural consequence of unleashing rather than suppressing human potential, of trusting citizens rather than commanding subjects, of building societies on consent rather than coercion. The factories ran day and night because the people who staffed them chose to be there, chose to contribute, chose to sacrifice for a future they believed worth creating. That choice, multiplied across millions, proved more powerful than any dictator's will, more enduring than any empire forged by force. And so the assembly lines turned, the ships launched, the bombers flew, until the ideology that denied their possibility lay buried beneath the rubble of its own hubris, defeated not merely by superior firepower, but by the superior idea that human beings, given freedom and purpose, can achieve what tyrants declare impossible. The furnaces cooled eventually, the factories retooled, but the lesson endures. Democracy's strength lies not in eliminating human imperfection, but in organizing it toward common goals without destroying the diversity and creativity that make those goals achievable. Hitler asked what Americans were producing. The answer ultimately was not just tanks and planes and ships, but proof that the future belonged not to the dictators, but to the free.